So today we're going to talk about agriculture kind of in general and really more the history or brief history, I guess I should say, of agriculture. We will talk a little bit about land and the global food system and a little bit about food security. The rest of the week we'll get into more specifics. So tomorrow, theoretically, we are looking at soils and soil properties, then we will look into pesticides, and then lastly, we'll look at fertilizers, and then that will finish us out for our 6-week session. So looking right now, we are trying to feed the world, and what we're going to discuss here as we get to the end of this lecture is that feeding the world in terms of actually having the right amount of food or the amount of food needed is not necessarily the problem. There's a lot of other roadblocks than just the sheer amount of food, and that's things like culturally appropriate, nutritionally appropriate, maybe running into some political concerns within a country. And so at this point, the actual number of food items at any given time is probably enough. And you can probably come to that decision when you just think of how many grocery stores are even just in the Milwaukee area, right? And how much food is in them at any given point, that if that's across the country or even in like a handful of countries, the amount of food is probably there. The challenge is going to be to feed perhaps 10 billion people by 2050 in a sustainable way that's not going to destroy global ecosystems and also be culturally and nutritionally sound for everyone involved. In terms of agriculture, it's going to provide for about 94% of the protein and 99% of the calories consumed by humans, and that particular statistic is from the FAO. The state of food insecurity in the world in 2006 was about 800 million people were in jeopardy. So we do know there's a large part of the population, especially in the developing world, that struggles to have a secure food source. We know that there are people in our own country, within our state, within our own cities that also are having issues getting food and nutritional food to survive and to be as healthy as they possibly could be. We can look at the first few, and by first few, we're going to look at the first 2 green revolutions, and then we're going to actually question the third green revolution and kind of not its legitimacy, but is it really a separate piece? So let's start with the first. And the first really is the first agricultural revolution, and that goes all the way back to when we started to make our transition from being nomadic and hunters and gatherers to a more permanent lifestyle. So some of the nomadic cultures were considered semi-permanent. So they may set down roots, but not live there continually. It might be more of a seasonal thing, or they're going to move within a range rather than just move wherever. When we were hunters and gatherers, it's really thought that we had a deep knowledge of the environment. There was a pretty low environmental impact because population density was so low and technology was low. Once we start to transition into more sediment populations, we can start to see that population density is going to increase, and we're going to start to see the impact go up. And initially, it's still going to be fairly small because population didn't grow exponentially until fairly recently. But we are going to see that that impact is going to go up. One thing that occurs during the first Green Revolution is really the designation between cultivation and domestication. So cultivation is deliberate activities or management of plants and animals that do not differ from those that are wild or indigenous to that area. So basically you're working with what you've got. You are potentially going to aid in it to stay alive. So when it's periods of dry, you might try to irrigate it or bring in water. If it's an animal, you may, we'll say, try to keep predators away from it, but you are not introducing something new that's not typically in that climate or in that region. You are working with what you have. Now, what we see is a lot of times when we're dealing with cultivation, and as we're going to get into a few details when we had our more nomadic society, is that then we had a greater variety in our diet because a lot of different things were growing naturally on their own. And so we had a lot more to choose from, though it may have been in smaller quantities, which means we had to choose from a lot of other options than just one. When we look at domestication, we can domesticate all sorts of things, plants, animals, and they typically result in food, fiber, fuel, and other products. It's often considered by some as the single most important intervention man has made on his environment. Domestication is both brought on through conscious and unconscious human selection. Basically, it's when we start to create plants and animals that end up being dependent on us for their survival. Okay, so we are doing everything in our power to keep them alive. And if we weren't to do that, then it may not be so successful. So I have an indoor cat, I think as I've mentioned, because sometimes she comes and sits with me while I'm recording these, and I don't know if you can hear her. But she has been indoor her entire life, and we always joke that if we left the door open, she probably would be curious to go outside, but as soon as her feet touched concrete and not what surfaces she knows of like wood and tile and carpet, she wouldn't know what to do with herself, and she would freeze and then turn around and run inside. That she almost knows how good she's got it because she would not survive outside in a natural environment. When you have other types of animals and dogs and, you know, indoor outdoor cats, they might be able to do a lot better because it's something they're used to, but she's spoiled because she lives inside and she doesn't have to like look for her food. And this is why sometimes zoos really have to make a conscious effort of how much work they're doing and how much interaction they have if they plan on just rehabilitating an animal or its captive breeding to go back out into the wild, because they don't want to domesticate that animal because then it's not going to be very successful once it gets out into the wild. And like I said, my cat, she would not do well, which is good. I don't want her to run away, but just to kind of give an example there for you. Okay, so let's talk about some dates though of domestication. Okay, in terms of animals, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle were first thought to be domesticated in the Near East between 10,500 years ago and 9,000 years ago. The next was followed by the cat, they believe. The first domesticated animal ever, though, is thought to be the dog because it was showed utility in hunting around 16,000 years ago, and they think that was most likely to have occurred in southern China. The horse was first thought to be domesticated in Kazakhstan, and the chicken in several locations in South and Southeast Asia. The donkey was thought to be domesticated in Northeast Africa around 5,000 years ago, and the water buffalo during Neolithic periods during the Neolithic period in South and East Asia. The pig may have been independently domesticated in the Middle East and China, roughly at the same time. The Hilly Flanks area is an area of major importance in terms of plants for domestication. Plants like wheat, barley, flax, lentils, and peas are some of the most valuable crops. And they were found there in large quantities. The grape was thought to be domesticated between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. The date palm around 7,000 years ago. The earliest domestication of rice in China was thought to be around 9,000 years ago, and cotton domesticated around 8,000 years ago. In terms of food security during the first Green Revolution, when we were hunters and gatherers, people had to move from place to place to have food. And basically they followed the animals and they followed optimal weather for plants to grow, and depending on where you were, that was going to certainly differ a little bit. Once we start to see people settling down, food is potentially more available, especially as we begin to domesticate, because we're putting more energy into keeping it alive and making sure we have it. However, one of the downsides from an environmental standpoint is once we settle down and have increased food production, that's when we tend to see population grow, which is going to increase density and population density, and which can then stress the food systems and impact our ecosystems as well. Once we settled, it's also thought that we note a nutritional standard decreasing as well. We started to see a drop in life expectancy and physical characteristics like average height dropping. It's thought that initially the average height of a man was 5'10", and then once we started to move away from hunter and gatherers, it went to 5'5", and women, the average height was 5'5" before settling down, and then it switched over to 5'1". And this is where we look at food security and say, okay, we can have food, but is it as nutritionally, I don't want to say necessarily important, or as balanced, maybe is the best way to say it, as it could be. Okay. The other thing, once you start to settle in, right, now you're really dealing with bad weather and natural hazards, potentially really making an impact on your location. And if you're committed to being settled, you're not just going to get up and walk away. And so it could increase the struggles you may have. In terms of farming and our sedentary settlements, we started to see what Andrew Sherrod is going to dub as the secondary products revolution. And basically, we're recognizing that we can use animals to further us in other ways than just eating them for meat. We could use them as mechanization for agriculture. So we could hook them up to a plow and have them plow our fields, which means it's going to be easier. Potentially, we can now have more land and be able to do it in the same amount of time than we had to previously. We could live further away from the city center, and so maybe we could move further out, and we're going to actually expand the footprint of our city or location. We also see the development of textiles with our plant material, and that can increase trade and exchange. And then lastly, we can have animal milk, and so now we could use land that was not optimal for farming and still be able to produce a product that wasn't just to feed our family, for others. Okay. The secondary products revolution, as argued by Sherrod, allows people to stay in one place, maybe be in areas that we wouldn't have considered settling in before, like semi-arid areas. If we're not going to try to grow something, but we have livestock, it may not be as big of a deal. And so we're going to have the impact on society starts to be a little bit greater, given that we have more things that now set it up for us to be a little more adapted to staying in one place for longer periods of time. We saw revolutionary changes in social systems and economics. We could see specialization, especially through the secondary products revolution, where trade became a thing. It now could move from, I have a working farm for my family, to I can really make money selling milk. So I don't need to have an agricultural field anymore because I can trade my milk, or I'm going to get money from my milk. Then it's going to allow me to buy meat from someone else. So we started to see specialization pop up and start to see basically the economics of agriculture start to grow. In terms of pastoralism and mobility, historically, pastoralism was practiced by nomadic people who would move their herds, and it could have been cattle, camels, goats, yaks, llamas, reindeer, horse, or sheep. And it was thought that it was really created from mixed farming needs. Okay, we could practice it again in landscapes that weren't great for agriculture, as long as we could feed our herd. And so it didn't have to be great. So we could see it done in semi-arid lands and grasslands for periods of time. When it was done as intended, it was actually in pretty good environmental balance and allowed for areas to restore and grow back a bit. When we see problems is when people stay in one place for an extended period of time. We'll see this become an issue in the Sahel, because after a period of wetter years, people got really comfortable in the area, so they stayed, and now it's led to things like desertification, which are irreversible or very slow to go back to what the natural environment may be. Now, the second green revolution we've actually already touched on in our history segment, and this is the time period that began after World War II. What we see is that typically we have an idea that we had a lot of people we needed to feed. And so you may remember us talking about that there was going to be major food security issues at the end of World War II. And so what we started to see were things like the increase in high yields, sharing of farming techniques to these other countries where we were worried about food security, taking the variety of species and plants we were planting and decreasing that. So there were some benefits and negatives of the second green revolution. The first benefit was high yield. So we're going to see an increase in agricultural production worldwide, including the developing world, and that's going to help with food security. And places we were looking at were places like India, and we were really teaching them how to grow wheat at the time. We were seeing that we were trying to find places where we could irrigate and crops that could use the irrigation that particular location was able to upheld. And really, we start to see a huge increase in cereal grains during this time, during the second Green Revolution, and that continues from the 50s to the 80s. There were a lot of low labor costs right after the war. There were a lot of people that immigrated here or migrated here that were looking for work and were fine with working in the fields and not getting paid very much. They were happy to have a job because they left their home country and came here and had nothing. And so people were able to take advantage of that. Food was also able to be pretty cheap because they were paying their workers like nothing. So, you know, standard is there's some kind of markup on everything you buy, right? So they were able to mark up but still keep the cost fairly low because what they were putting into it was not super expensive. They were also able, with these higher yielding plants, to grow more than they had before. And so they were able to lower production costs, which can lower consumer costs. Okay. We saw greater food security. We saw some consistency in crop growth. One particular strain of wheat tripled production level in just 20 years. So we start to see that there are some positives that come out of this. In terms of negatives, we see it become energy intensive. We have a lot of energy going into producing crops. So over time, the ratio of crop to energy has decreased. There was a high demand on resources. In some cases, we're now needing increased water, could be increased use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. We started to see the degradation of soil through things like fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. They can lead to increased levels of erosion and pollution. We may not be resting the soil as much as we may have been previously. And we definitely saw a disruption of nature's services because when we add things to fields or push soil to its limits, we're going to impact the rate that they can take in nitrogen and carbon. And again, those things that we're not always thinking about because we're not actually paying for or seeing work, they're going on behind the scenes. Now, most people will argue that the third Green Revolution starts when we really get into genetically modified organisms. So this would be kind of the very recent past, okay? Really looking at the 1990s for most people is when we saw the growth of GMOs, and we have about 11% of the Earth's arable land covered by GMOs. In the US, 90% of corn, cotton, and soybeans are genetically modified. GMOs are debated in other places in the world, so it just kind of depends where you are and what the policy is on GMOs and how frequently or high in production they actually are. So when we look at agriculture as a resource, we need to look at land and soil. Not all land and soil is created equal, especially when it comes to agriculture, and so we have some limits there. In terms of biological resources, we're looking at domesticated organisms, genetics for GMOs. In terms of water, 80% of the nation's consumptive water use and over 90% in many Western states goes to agriculture, and those numbers come out of the EPA. In 1960, the application rate of fertilizer was 46 pounds per acre per year. By 2004, it was 146 pounds per acre per year. And 2011 comes in somewhere between 130 to 140 pounds per acre per year. So it did go down a little bit. And this puts all three, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizers together, which we'll talk about a little later this week. Materials from mechanized farming are resources that we need. Energy, whether it's human or gas or oil, whatever we're using to run some of our mechanized machinery, and then certainly human resources, so like physical work from people, even if a lot of it is still mechanized. So we look at this idea of what is sustainable agriculture. In the 1990 Farm Bill, which is actually called the U.S. Food, Agriculture, Conservation, and Table Act of 1990. It's going to be the first act here in the United States that's going to define sustainable agriculture, and it's going to do so as an integrated system of plant and animal production practices having a site-specific application that will over the long term satisfy human food and giver needs. enhance environmental quality and the natural resource base upon which the agricultural economy demands, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources and on-farm resources, and integrate where appropriate natural biological cycles and controls, and then lastly, sustain the economic viability of a farm operation and engage in the quality of life for farmers and members of rural communities and society as a whole. If we look at the global food system, we are going to see that most people agree that it is broken, given that we know that there are billions of people that do not have food that is appropriate, or food in the quantities they need, or food that's, again, culturally appropriate or nutritionally appropriate. The other reason why a lot of people think that it's broken is because with as many people that we have that don't get the food that they need, we also have locations where people are overfed, and where we have an obesity problem or an overweight problem. The global food system is responsible for 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than all emissions from transport, heating, lighting, and air conditioning combined. It's thought that 820 million people were hungry last year, according to the UN, while 1/3 of those people did not get enough vitamins. 600 million people were classified as obese, and 2 billion people overweight, with serious consequences towards their health. Some research feel that reducing meat and dairy consumption is the single biggest ways individuals can lessen their impact on the planet. Other issues that we'll talk about are going to be things like food waste, and again, there's sometimes political boundaries depending on the part of the world that we're looking in. So if we look at food loss and food waste, the definitions from the UN state that food loss is a decrease in quality or quantity of food. They define food waste as food fit for human consumption that is thrown out or used in other ways. In low-income countries or the developing world, food loss happens due to limited harvesting capabilities, poor storage, or deficiencies in transportation, processing, or infrastructure. In medium to high-income countries or the developed world, food loss is more often to happen in the consumer side, so thrown out food from the refrigerator, the supermarkets, restaurants, and so we see a big difference. So in lower income developing world countries, we're seeing that it's just not getting off the field. It's not getting to the people. In the developed world, it gets to the people and then it's wasted at that point. And so as you looked at your ecological footprint, usually, and I'm recording this before you guys are doing this, but usually in semesters past, it's one of those things that comes up a lot that's like, I could be a better shopper because I buy things and I don't get to it in time, and then it goes bad and I need to throw it out. And so a lot of people recognize this and they're like, because it's hard. You really, no one plans on just throwing money away by buying something that they're going to throw in the trash. But sometimes, things get pushed in the back of the refrigerator, or you don't check the date and it's a lot sooner than you thought it was, and then you don't want to eat it because you're afraid of getting sick. So, there's a lot of ways that it's easy to fall into this trap, even though that's certainly not your intention. Okay. If we look at some food loss, food waste information from the National Resource Defense Council, we will see that up to 40% in the U.S. is never eaten. 1 in 8 Americans struggle to put enough food on the table. According to the EPA, 94% of food that we throw away ends up in landfills or combustion facilities. In 2017, 38.1 million tons of food waste was disposed of. 2014 numbers show that we waste about 31% of our annual available food supply, and in 2010 prices, that comes to about $161.6 billion, which is a lot. So what are the benefits of reducing food waste? Can reduce methane emissions, especially as things like rice and cattle put up a lot of methane in their production and growing. Can certainly save you money, right? We just talked about no one ever intends to just like throw money in the trash can. And then conserves energy and resources if we do a better job of trying to be on top of that. Globally, the world produces about 1.4 tons of food, which could feed 2 billion people. 1.4 tons of food waste, which could feed I'm going to start completely over. Are you ready? Okay. Globally, the world produces about 1.4 tons of food waste that could feed 2 billion people. And so that is quite a bit of food waste globally that we are seeing. Okay, here is a U.S. distribution of cropland, and we're going to kind of get into some of the details here on this. If you grew up in this area your entire life, or at least in the Midwest, you are familiar with cropland. If you grew up somewhere else, it may not be as normal to you to see as much farmland, but here's kind of our geographic distribution. And this is from 2012, so it's a little dated, but it's probably looking quite similar if we were able to have the published for 2020 already out. All right, so arable land is going to be land that's suitable for cultivated agriculture. Now the problem is there's limits, and there's limits for various reasons. The first are climate regions. It could be too arid, which basically means it's too dry, or it could be too cold, and so things are not going to do well. We have topographic limits. Topographic means basically like an elevation profile, and so if it's too steep, if it's an area that's too wet because it gets too much rain, it's too erodible, meaning that basically it's a combination of being too steep and too wet where the material just can't stay basically in place and it's going to move down the hill. In terms of soil limits, according to climatecentral.org, the Earth has lost 1/3 of its arable land in the past 40 years. And they say there's two big reasons for this. The first is chemicals. So we have heavy use of fertilizers that have degraded soils across the world. And so we see that chemical degradation of soils is 100 times greater than the rate of soil formation. Erosion is also a big problem, and we talked a lot about this when we were coming out of the Dust Bowl, and some of our New Deal programs were looking specifically into soil and soil erosion. It largely occurs due to the loss of structure of continual disturbance from crop planting and harvesting. When soil is continually turned over, it's exposed to oxygen and its carbon is released into the atmosphere. And so that causes it to not bind to the soil next to it as well. And so it makes it harder for it to hold on to water, which also can help and add some cohesion to those soil molecules. And so then it can get picked up by water or by air and move onward. We can convert other land into arable land potentially, but it would be at a very great expense, both cost and environmentally. So if we look at land use in the lower 48, these are NRCS stats. Roughly 18% of land is cropland, 21% is rangeland, 6% is pasture. So about 45% of land is some type of agricultural base, depending. Those numbers will change then depending on where you are, and you can kind of see that in our little pie graphs there. The image is also from the NRCS, and it's showing numbers by region, so Northeast Appalachia, Southeast, the Delta states, Southern Plains, Northern Plains, Lake states, Mountain, and then Pacific. We have the Conservation Reserve Program, which provides technical and financial assistance to eligible farmers and ranchers to address soil, water, and related natural resource concerns on their lands in an environmentally beneficial and cost-effective manner. Yearly rental payments were given in exchange for farmers removing environmentally sensitive land from agricultural production and planting species that will improve environmental quality. It was administered by the Farm Service Agency. Contracts ran 10 to 15 years. The long-term goal was to reestablish valuable land cover to help improve water quality, prevent soil erosion, and reduce loss of wildlife habitat. It was signed into law by Reagan in 1985. Now, remember, we did something very similar to this during the New Deal programs, not necessarily from an environmental standpoint, but to help balance out food production as people were struggling to pay for food and we were seeing food wasted off the field. Now, one thing we can look at is this idea of population versus physiological density. So we all know what population density is. It's the number of people per land area. Physiological density is the number of people per arable land. And so we can see, if we look at some of these countries, that some of their stats don't balance out well. So like the population density of Egypt is not super high, but their physiological density is pretty high because they only have 3% arable land. And if you geographically think about where Egypt is and the characteristics of Egypt, that makes a lot of sense. Bangladesh is actually in a pretty good spot. However, they are certainly at risk they have the monsoon season, so they get flooded fairly frequently, but they could get extremely flooded that would cause a lot of problems. We can also look at farming in terms of the economy of scale. So we can look at average farm size. So typically the average size of a farm increases as numbers of farms decreases. In 2019, the average size of a farm was 443 acres, which was up from 2007, where the average size was 418 acres. There was, however, a notable drop in size between 2006 and 2007. If we look at exports, exports were valued at $143.3 billion in 2008 and are expected to decrease in 2019 to have a total number of $137 billion in export. If we look at number of farms, in 2018 there were about 2 million farms, and that's a number that's been dropping since 2007, where we had about 2.2 million farms. Texas still contains the most farms, and in 2018 they had 248,000 farms. And so a lot of times what we see is people start to get out of the farming business, and so one farm may then buy another farm to get that land, and so we see the size increase as the number of farms decreases. So let's look at some terms that become important in terms of food security and other issues that are kind of the social issue of growing food. Okay, in terms of food security, we're looking at the ability of a national government to feed its population. UNFAO says, quote, food that is available at all times, that all persons have means to access it, that is nutritionally adequate in terms of quantity, quality, and a variety that is acceptable within a given country. Okay, so it can't just be that we have hungry people in, we'll just say, I'll make up a country X in Africa, and McDonald's is like, we see your food insecurity. We are going to send Big Macs for the next 10 years or something, okay? That may not be culturally appropriate for them. They may not want to eat that. That may be the same way that when I would travel and if I was offered like a praying mantis on a stick, like that would not work for me. I think I mentioned this in one of the first lectures. Like for me, I just couldn't do it, and that's not even a cultural thing. That's just bugs to me are bugs. They're not food, and I just can't get past that. So, just having some organization step up and be like, look, here, we're just going to send all this food. If they're not thinking about what's culturally appropriate and if it's what people want to eat, then it's not actually helping. And we'll ignore the idea of nutrition with my example with that as well. If we look at starvation versus famine, starvation is a severe deficiency in caloric intake below the level needed to maintain an organism's life. It is going to be the most extreme form of malnutrition. Okay. Famine, on the other hand, is widespread scarcity of food caused by several factors, including war, inflation, crop failure, population imbalance, or government policies. So starvation tends to be, and this is not always across the board, but it tends to be a condition where you are not getting the caloric intake you need. Famine typically is referred to as a type of event because other events like droughts or wars or government issues, policies that may be going on are keeping food from people, or the climate conditions, right? So it tends to be an event. Time frame doesn't necessarily matter. That's not necessarily a distinction, because you could have a inappropriate caloric intake for a very long period of time, just as long as a drought may land. So that's why I like to say that starvation is more of a condition where you're not getting enough calories, while famine can be more of an event because it coincides with other things that are going on that are also typically classified as events. Okay. We can also look at undernutrition versus malnutrition. Undernutrition is a deficiency of calories or of one or more essential nutrients. It may develop because people cannot obtain or prepare food. Could be because they have a genetic disorder that they're not able to eat certain things, or they can't absorb certain nutrients into their body appropriately, or have an increased need for calories. Okay, so basically you're getting a deficiency in something for various reasons, but you're not to the point where you are starving. Malnutrition is the lack of proper nutrition. It's caused by not having enough to eat, not eating enough of the right things, or being unable to use the food that one does not eat. So malnutrition I think the best way to describe it is that first part of that definition, which is the lack of proper nutrition. So you theoretically could be malnourished, but not hungry all the time. You may just not be eating what you need to be considered nutritionally in the right spot, right? So like, this is it's not an extreme example, it's a weird example, but I mean, at this point, we're 6 weeks in, you should be expecting this. So like when people used to get scurvy when they were on ships like pirates and sailors because they weren't getting enough vitamin C, like they would be considered malnourished in that sense because they weren't getting the vitamins they need. They could also be considered undernourished because they're not getting an essential nutrient at that point. And so they may not be starving by definition, but you could be malnourished or undernourished. Okay, when we look at nutritional value, you know what this is. This is what's on the back of everything that you eat. It's going to include calories, protein, a mix of essential amino acids, fats, micronutrients, and vitamins. Okay, so we can look at these FAO hunger maps that they put out. They don't put them out, they're not as current to the current year that we're in. So this one is from 2015, and they base these maps on what they call a Target 1 goal. And the Target 1 goal was set between 1990 and 1992, and it's the proportion of people suffering from undernourishment, and their goal is to reduce this proportion below 5% globally. They basically look at the indicatory measures of the, proportion of the population between the minimum level of dietary energy consumption. They do not ever look at this in developed nations, which in some cases means that you are not considering a portion of the population because all developed countries still have a problem with hunger. So, they are leaving people out. However, I think the way they're looking at it is it's not a majority of the population, which again, on every given year could be different, and in different cities could be different, and different, so if we're looking at the European Union, it could be different in different countries. And so it's not always the best way to look at it. However, if you are looking in the developing world, that's where they're going to focus in and give you their information. They look at what they call undernourishment, which is the measure of probability that randomly selected individuals in the population is consuming an amount of dietary energy which is insufficient to cover his or her requirements to lead an active and healthy life. So that's what they're looking at. If you Google this image, you can zoom in a little bit better and see all the extra information that's on here, but I just kind of gave you the quick overview of what they're looking at. We can also see, in comparison again to 1990 to 1992, where there's been improvements and where there is not an improvement. And again, this map represents 2015. And so we can see that green means they are closer to reaching their goal, if not already reaching their goal. Red and orange means that they've seen setbacks and they have not reached those goals. And then again, what they're saying here in this particular map is that yellow color that the United States is. These are continuously very low undernourishment measures, less than 5% of the population. So they're not tracking those as much. Okay, so we talked about kind of the Green Revolution. So the first Green Revolution being switching from hunter-gatherers to sedentary, having farmland, expanding the farmland, the secondary products revolution, Then the second green revolution, we've talked about, that's following World War II, where we start to focus in on higher yields and fertilizer and pesticide use. And then we get into what the third green revolution with a question mark is. Does that start in the 90s when we look at GMOs? For our purposes, we're going to say there are three. And so you'll want to know hunter-gatherers, first green revolution, what their actions were. World War II marks the start of the second green revolution. And then the 1990s, GMOs are going to be our third green revolution. The rest of our lectures, as I mentioned in the first slide, soils, pesticides, and then fertilizers. And then we are done for our 6-week session.